to render a verdict, or the judge would declare a mistrial. We're waiting to find out which direction this case has gone. In the meantime, though, let's go ahead and take a live look into that courtroom. If we sense things are escalating and we're about to find out what happened, we'll go ahead and take that audio full. But in the meantime, to bring you up to speed, Michael Jackson-Bolanos, you can see the shot of him there, is accused of killing Woll at her Lafayette Park home back in October of last year. We just found out the judge is sharing what the jury has come to. We'll listen in live.
As to count 2, first-degree premeditated murder.
Not guilty.
As to count 3, home invasion first degree.
Deadlocked.
And as to count 4, concealing facts or misleading the police.
Guilty.
All jurors, please stand and raise your right hands.
Members of the jury, listen to your verdict as recorded by the court. You do say upon your oath that you find Michael Jackson-Bolanos hung as to count 1, first-degree felony murder, not guilty as to count 2, first-degree premeditated murder, hung as to count 3, home invasion first degree, and guilty of count 4, concealing facts or misleading the police. So say you, Mr. Foreperson, so say you, members of the jury.
Thank you. You may be seated. Would you like the members of the jury polled?
No, Your
No?
No.
Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I know this went much longer than we ever thought it would, and you did yeoman's work in this case, and appreciate your attempts to come back day after day and trying to reach a verdict, because after such a long trial, we wanted to give every opportunity to try to reach a full verdict as to all counts, and I understand it's just not possible. So I am going to come back and speak with you personally and give you some certificates from the court, and then I believe the attorneys are going to want a chance to talk to you as well, and you'll be able to talk to them. The restriction of not talking to attorneys is now lifted for you in this case. I guess I'd prefer you not give interviews to the press, because we're going to have to possibly retry the case as to counts 1 and 3. And so, if you know, so anyway, but you are free to do what you want. And so at this time, you are dismissed from your duties as jurors in this case, and we appreciate your time, attention, and efforts in this case. So the deputies are going to lead you back over to Judge Knapp's courtroom, and I'll be over there momentarily to come address you, and then the attorneys will come after I have a chance to talk to you in private. Okay? All rise for the jury.
Okay, so again, this is breaking news coverage here on CBS News Detroit. A verdict in the Samantha Woll murder trial. I want to go ahead and bring in former federal prosecutor and current criminal defense attorney Rick Convertino. He joins us live in studio. Rick, we just heard a little guilty, a little not guilty. Jury still seems to be hung on some of these charges. We're going to break that all down in just a moment. But in the meantime, there are so many eyes on this case across the state, across the country. Sorry about that. We are going to go back to our stream here on CBS News Detroit. Again, this concludes here on air, but we are headed to the CBS News Detroit stream, which you can watch online or on Pluto TV. We'll continue the conversation there. All right, for those of you who have been on the stream with us the entire time, thank you for that little momentary pause as we switch over from TV back to here. Once again, introducing Rick Convertino. What do you make of kind of the mixed bag? Does that surprise you at all?
Depends on what it is. I mean, I don't have an IBF, so I'm not sure what the verdict was regarding the makeup of the jury's decision. So I'm not sure how to comment. But other than it's not uncommon for a jury to come back with on a multi-count case and have different verdicts for each count dependent on the evidence. So I wouldn't be surprised if, for instance, they came back with a guilty verdict on the charge of lying to law enforcement during the course of the investigation. The defendant came in and was interviewed twice at least and did lie several times, said he wasn't in the area, said he didn't have anything to do with the the body, didn't go up to the body, or had no idea about Ms. Woll being on the sidewalk at the time. That, of course, was a lie. He later admitted to that. He said he lied because he was afraid, which makes sense. So I wouldn't be surprised if they came back. He admitted to it, so all the elements would have been met pursuant to his confession. But I would be surprised if they came back with a guilty verdict on the homicide. And of course, we don't know. Couldn't hear it. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that.
We started to talk about this a little bit earlier. Samantha Woll's murder came at such a time of heightened tension. Yes. So this was right at the real start of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. So you have so many eyes on the story from across the country, quite frankly, around the world, because there were initially fears of anti-Semitism motivations. This has been further complicated by, at one point, an ex-boyfriend had confessed to the murder and said he must have killed her, but he didn't remember. How much, with it being convoluted in that way, do you think that impacted the jury? Not just having one clear suspect, but you have somebody who previously confessed and recanted.
Well, it must naturally have had, considerable impact on the jury. They had to weigh and consider whether or not that was a large part of the defense as well. The defense claimed that it very well may have been the ex-boyfriend who did, in fact, confess to the homicide. And then later recanted based upon his self-diagnosed influence of marijuana and hallucinogenic drugs and his mental illness. So he said that he confessed based upon a myriad of those three things. But it must have had an impact on at least several of the jurors. They had to weigh whether or not the defense's theory of the case was actually in line with the evidence. But there was so much during the course of this investigation that was missed and not pursued, including a lot of the evidence that directly related to the former boyfriend's involvement in this crime. They didn't take any of his clothing, as they did with Mr. Jackson-Bolanos, and Mr. Bolanos' clothing indicated that he was not at the scene in the apartment at the time, except for the 2 drops of blood that was on his jacket, of his North Face jacket, which he said was due to the fact that he checked Ms. Woll's pulse for and tried to see if she was still breathing at the time. And so none of the follow-up was done effectively with the initial confessor, Ms. Woll's ex-boyfriend. A lot was missed at that point.
So you just heard a little ding there. We were transparent about our audio struggles. It was dipping in and out,
yes.
Unfortunately, right as that verdict was being read in the courtroom. That ding is CBS News Detroit's Gino Vici confirming the jury was deadlocked on felony murder, not guilty on first-degree murder, deadlocked on home invasion, and guilty on the count you suspected of lying to police.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Deadlocked on felony murder.
Okay.
Not guilty on first-degree murder, deadlocked on home invasion, guilty on lying to police. And that's Gino saying the audio's still out in the courtroom, so everybody's a little stressed and trying to gather information. I'll hand this back off to our producer.
Rochelle, that's a bizarre, incongruent verdict because the felony murder is based, the first-degree murder is based on the felony that was committed that would raise it to a first-degree murder. So, but the key is, and which I said earlier I thought would be, is a not guilty on the first-degree murder, right? Mm-hmm. You can confirm that there's a not guilty verdict on the first-degree murder. According
to that text update, yeah. But audio is in and out for them as well. They're sitting just outside, and you said it's a little chaotic as people try to get those bits and pieces. But that was why I asked you that very first question. I think a lot of times in these trial cases, you anticipate some charges guilty, some yes. not, but to be hung on some and then have very concise decisions made right. on others. I don't know if I've personally seen that before.
Well, the felony murder is a felony occurs during the course of an incident where a homicide results from the attendant facts surrounding the underlying felony. So it would be a robbery, could be the underlying felony, that strong arm robbery that results in a murder. So that would be a felony murder. And so it's a heightened it's a heightened sentence. And so to say that the first degree murder, which would necessarily include the felony, but is an acquittal, and then a hung jury on the attendant felony murder is incongruent. And what were the other, do you recall the other two? So I wouldn't be surprised, as we talked about before, if there was a guilty verdict on the admission of the lie during the course of the investigation to the officers. But you know, the key on this is the first degree murder. There's an acquittal on the first degree murder. That's huge. Whether
and to quickly answer your question, was guilty on lying to police.
Okay, so that's congruent. That makes sense. The felony murder, the jury being hung on the felony murder doesn't quite make sense to me. But now you have the major charge. There is a not guilty verdict. And the felony murder charge, there's a hung jury. There's a guilty verdict on the underlying lying to officers during the course of the investigation. And so the prosecution now has to determine whether or not they're going to rebring the felony murder case against Mr. Jackson-Bolanos. And I certainly hope they don't do it based upon everything that they missed and based upon the jury's verdict on the first degree murder.
You're a defense attorney, former federal prosecutor. I mean, your insight invaluable here. So something I want to ask you, when this judge, I think it was maybe day 2 or 3, came out and said, if the jury does not reach a verdict by Thursday, I will declare a mistrial. We had 5 days of deliberations. They were hung on some of those charges. From your experience, is that typical, atypical to give a jury 5 days and then give up on a verdict?
Well, I've been trying cases for about 35 years, all over the country, in state and federal courts. I've never, ever heard of or seen personally or heard of a judge who gives a timeline to a jury to deliberate and come to conclusions.
Wow.
I haven't. It's improper if it occurred in this case. If a jury sends notes back saying they're at an impasse, of course, then you give an Allen charge. A judge would give an Allen charge and say, hey, go back and keep trying. Consider the opinions of your fellow jurors. Think about it hard. And if you again can't come to an impasse, tell me. And the jury, after the first time they said they were at an impasse, asked for additional evidence. Then they said they were at an impasse, and then the judge gave them the Allen charge, said go back. Then we had an alternate jury replace a juror who had to leave because of travel issues. And so you now have, this is only the second day for the newly constructed jury. So really, and this jury, the new jury, with the alternate, did not send out any notes saying that they were at an impasse at all. So to put a time frame on that would have been extremely unusual. And there's no legal purpose, no legal basis to do that.
Do you know, does a judge typically have any insight on whether or not this was one juror who couldn't be swayed to the majority of the juror, or if it was 50-50? Are they given a look behind that glass to just know how rough of shape they're in terms of reaching a verdict?
Normally, no. The judge wouldn't have any additional insight that's not shared with the attorneys. Now, I had a case in front of Judge Van Houten where there was a hung jury. In that case, as I recall, one of the notes that came out that said they were at an impasse said the number were 10-2 for not guilty. And so the judge shared that with us. The judge didn't share that in open court, but the attorneys, both parties and the judge were aware of where the jury was at that point in time. So that may make it's an excellent question. It may make a difference if the note comes out we're 6-6.
Right, and she just had less faith in
or we're 11-1. That's a possibility that person may come around, and certainly there was a much better possibility that the jury would come to a conclusion, come to a verdict after the new juror was constituted the new jury after the alternate became a member of the jury.
All right, Rick, thank you. We're going to go ahead and toss it out live to Walter Murphy, who is there. Walter, what can you tell us? So it's been a chaotic 10 minutes and a lot to break down here.
Yeah, that's right. So everyone who was in the courtroom when that verdict was read, they're still in there. They have not left the courtroom yet, but like you guys have been mentioning, the jury was deadlocked on all of those charges other than lying to police. And like I mentioned, it has been a chaotic 10 minutes, and everyone is still inside of that courtroom right now. We're waiting for them to leave the courtroom so we can get a sense of what the mood was like inside when that verdict was read. And as you can understand, I'm sure that the family might want to talk to us. They might, feel upset about that. I'm sure the defendant, I'm sure he is probably thrilled with the hung jury, but we are still working to get more information, and we're still going to stay live here with you in downtown Detroit. But for now, reporting in downtown Detroit, I'm Walter Murphy, CBS News Detroit.
Walter, thank you so much for that live report. And then just to recap, because again, audio was going in and out a bit as that verdict was being read in a split decision. The jury said they were unable to reach a verdict on 2 charges. That was murder and also home invasion. The jury found him not guilty of premeditated murder while finding him guilty of lying to police, which is the charge you anticipated that guilty verdict on the most. Do you think we will hear from a foreperson with this case?
Oh, probably. In a case like this, you'll hear from, there'll be a public pronouncement by, one or more of the jurors in a case this high profile. So I think there'll be some clarification pretty soon. Now, also the parties will have an opportunity, if the jury wants to talk to the jurors in the back of the courtroom, in the course of the afternoon, I'm sure. The judge will go back and talk to the juries, thank them, and see what the jurors individually may have thought, and the parties will have an opportunity if the jury collectively wants that. But I think we'll probably, in a case like this, we'll probably hear from one or more of the jurors pretty soon, probably today or tonight.
Now, in those charges they were unable to reach a verdict on, what do you anticipate happening next? I mean, it's a huge time investment. It's a huge financial investment to have a trial like this. Do you anticipate Michael Jackson-Bolanos going through it again, or where do we go from here?
Well, it's an interesting, again, I think it's very incongruent verdict. The home invasion, felony murder is the jurors were hung on, meaning they couldn't come to a decision beyond a reasonable doubt. So that case, that segment of this case is the one where there is the least, in fact, zero evidence that Mr. Jackson-Bolanos was ever in that apartment, ever. And the home invasion, of course, would necessarily mean that he would have to enter that apartment and commit a murder as a result, or the natural effect of the home invasion, where he maybe stumbled upon her and committed this homicide. That's the theory. This, I think, was a murder that involved rage, that involved personalization.
A lot of people have used the word passion.
Passion, based upon the wounds that were inflicted on Ms. Woll, about her head, neck, and face. Those are not something typically that someone would do if they were caught in the act of breaking into a home, for instance. The timeline that was presented at trial is very consistent with the homicide occurring closer to 1:30 a.m. and not 4:30 a.m. when Mr. Jackson-Bolanos was seen in the area. If you recall, there was a still photo of a surveillance camera that showed an individual running from the area at about 1:40 a.m., sometime after the last time the motion was detected in the apartment of Ms. Woll. And that person, according to the defense attorney, Mr. Brown, and they showed it on the screen, and I thought it was accurate, looked an awful lot like the stature, haircut, and presence of the initial confessor, the ex-boyfriend. So there was so much doubt that was placed into the record on this case, and in fact, there's nothing, not one iota of evidence that placed Mr.
Michael Jackson-Bolanos. Yeah,
Michael Jackson-Bolanos inside that apartment at all.
Well, we now have a clean feed of that audio as the jury's decisions were being read. We're going to go ahead and listen to that from the courtroom.
The case, the people of the state of Michigan versus Michael Manuel Jackson-Bolanos. Mr. Foreperson, will you please read the verdict form as marked as to count 1, first-degree felony murder?
Deadlocked.
As to count 2, first-degree premeditated murder?
Not guilty.
As to count 3, home invasion first degree?
Deadlocked.
And as to count 4, concealing facts or misleading the police?
Guilty.
Again, a clean feed of that as it was being read. What do you think are the feelings right now from the defense?
Well, initially,
he seemed pretty reactionless.
Yeah. Sense of relief, most importantly, because of the acquittal on the major charge, but on the two other, the home invasion and the felony murder, still the jury did not come back with a guilty verdict. So there's a lot of solace there. The case will be continued. They'll have to determine whether or not they want to bring this case against Mr. Jackson-Bolanos again, based on the lack of evidence inside the apartment. Again, I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, but there is no evidence at all that puts him inside that apartment. There's evidence that has him touching Ms. Woll at some point because there's blood on his jacket. But I mean, consider this: there were 8 stab wounds about the head, the neck, and the face of Ms. Woll. The apartment was inundated with blood. There was blood on the wall as she tried to crawl up the wall to get to her feet after what the defense forensic pathologist said was regaining her consciousness after a couple of hours. She walks outside, there's blood outside, there's just a plethora of blood, both blood and blood spatter. That would have covered somebody. There would have been evidence somehow that would link the perpetrator back to that inside of the apartment. There was a footprint that didn't come back. Pardon me, didn't come back to Mr. Jackson-Bolanos. It was unidentified. There were no fingerprints of him. There were no the knife did not match any of the wounds that were inflicted on Ms. Woll. So none of that evidence was checked off against the initial confessor, the ex-boyfriend. He had a burn pit in his yard. They didn't pull any evidence from the burn pit to see if there were any clothes that were placed in there, shoes that were placed in there. He had a knife that wasn't examined or taken. The interview of him was exceedingly different, markedly different from the interview of Mr. Jackson-Bolanos. They didn't press him. They asked him if he wanted snacks. They asked him if he wanted his attorney present. They were careful in plotting with him as to not be overly aggressive. Totally different from Mr. Jackson-Bolanos. They were aggressive. They deceived him. Tried to deceive him. They were swearing at him. This case, they really should. I hope that the Wayne County prosecution takes a long and hard look at whether or not to bring this again and refocus the investigation.
Yeah, certainly some conversations happening now within DPD and the county as a whole, as you said. We want to toss it back out to Walter Murphy, who is live there. Walter, have you seen anyone come out of that courtroom yet?
No, we still haven't seen anyone come out of the courtroom, but I was just told a few moments ago that they are going to be holding a press conference shortly. I'm not sure exactly how long that is going to take for them to come out of the courtroom, but we are going to stay out here, and we will bring you that as soon as they do come out here and they do offer that press conference. But like you guys have been talking about, that jury was deadlocked. Now, that was on the charges of felony murder, not guilty on first-degree murder. And, well, they were deadlocked on home invasion and not guilty on first-degree murder, guilty of lying to police. Again, lots of questions that we still have, so hopefully we'll be able to get those answers when that press conference starts in a few moments.
All right, Walter, looking forward to that. Thank you for the live update. Something else I wanted to ask you about, Rick, what happens with Jackson-Bolanos now in terms of custody?
Well,
there were some bond issues,
yes,
correct?
Yes, he's a detained defendant right now, so at some point they had a bond hearing prior to the trial. Whether he was a risk of flight or a danger to the community, those are the two central issues that occur during a bond issue. The judge ruled that in fact he was a danger or a risk of flight, and therefore he was detained pending trial. Now at this point, on count one, count one, premeditated murder, first-degree murder, he was acquitted of those charges. There's inclusivity on the conclusions of the two other charges. On a minor charge, he was convicted. He'll therefore have to, he has strictures placed on him because of his conviction and the lying to the police. I would anticipate Mr. Brown, the defense attorney, would make a motion to have him released pending sentencing on the charge he was convicted on, and the prosecution will have to determine whether or not he is going to be recharged. So at this point, I would believe that he's going to make a motion asking for his release, with some kind of strictures if they're going to recharge, maybe a home detention or a device, monitoring device. But the judge will make that decision, have to do that today. And so I think he'll be released. And that'll be an indication of where the judge believes this case really lies.
As you've been speaking, we've been seeing video here on the screen of Jackson-Bolanos swearing in and taking the stand. This was a big development as it happened in the past week here. We've had some high-profile cases in Detroit very recently. Jennifer Crumbley took the stand in the Oxford trial. James Crumbley decided not to. There's always so much anticipation about if the defendant is going to take the stand in their own defense. What do you make of that ultimately by the outcome? Do you feel it helped him now at this point that they were at least hung on those large charges?
I watched his testimony. It's always, as a prosecutor 20 years, whenever
risky.
When a defendant takes the stand, it's always a problem for the prosecution. Jurors, in my estimation, want to give the benefit of the doubt to someone who testifies. They want to hear. I know there's an instruction. I know it's a constitutional preamble that you have not to testify as a defendant. I just think that based upon my experience in speaking with jurors over the years, they want to necessarily, who wouldn't? You want to hear somebody explain themselves in these heinous crimes. And so him getting up there, having prior convictions, getting up there and facing that jury, I think was huge. It's either going to be a home run or a hit by pitch, and he hit a home run. He was clear, concise, direct. I think he was honest. He answered all the questions. The prosecution, I think their cross-examination of him was feckless. It was simply, basically, you're a liar and a thief, of which he readily admitted. He lied seriatim throughout the course of the investigation because he was afraid. He said he was a common thief, but he wasn't a murderer. Mm-hmm. And I think he said that clear and resoundingly, and I think the jurors believed him. At least, clearly they believed him. They acquitted him on the first-degree murder. Now, whether some jurors believed he was in that house, and therefore, if they believed that he was in that house, in that apartment, to create a home invasion or to steal, rob, whatever, and that the murder occurred inside the house, that would make them conclude, obviously, that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the two counts that he was acquitted on. So there are some jurors who think that he was in that house or weren't convinced that he wasn't in the house at the time or the apartment at the time. But like I said, that to me was the part of this case that was conclusive, that there is no evidence tying him to ever being inside that apartment at any time. No fingerprints on the door, no fingerprints inside the house, no blood that would be consistent with someone who,
just a little on a jacket.
A little on a jacket, and so nothing, I think, puts him in there at the time of the murder.
To your point, when he took the stand, I think that's when the tide turned a bit for a lot of people, because as you mentioned, he said, I am a liar. I am a thief. He owned up to that. He said, I'm just not a murderer. And I can imagine from a juror's standpoint, when you have someone being that clear and direct and vulnerable and transparent about their shortcomings, that maybe that earned a little bit of trust there. You and I had spoke behind the scenes during this trial. I love always asking you what you predict is going to happen and what you're gathering throughout. You even knew the jury wasn't reaching a verdict here by the way the judge ruled, or the way the judge shared. The jury is done deliberating.
Done deliberating.
You're like, she would have said the verdict is in. That means they're hung on at least some of these charges. But you and I were talking, and you thought this was going to end faster than it did, right? Did this go in terms? Were you anticipating not guilty a little sooner?
Oh, yes. Yes. I'm sorry. My general rule of thumb is that for every week of trial, you give the jury about a day to deliberate. So in this case, there was 14, 15 days. So roughly 3 weeks of trial. So that's, would be about 3 days. They came back here in 2 days. So, quicker than the average kind of over the years. The computation that I have personally is about a day for a week. So it's about right. It's a little quicker than usual, but I thought this would be a quicker verdict.
All right, thank you for your insight. We're going to go ahead and we're going to play that verdict, the audio from the courtroom once again for you. Again, a mixed bag coming from jurors. Go ahead and take a listen.
The case, the people of the state of Michigan versus Michael Jackson-Bolanos. Mr. Foreperson, will you please read the verdict form as marked as to count 1, first-degree felony murder?
Deadlocked.
As to count 2, first-degree premeditated murder?
Not guilty.
As to count 3, home invasion first degree?
Deadlocked.
And as to count 4, concealing facts or misleading the police?
Guilty.
So once again, jurors were only able to reach a unanimous guilty decision on one charge, and that was lying to police. He was found not guilty of first-degree murder, and the jurors were deadlocked on the home invasion charges and on felony murder. We are anticipating a press conference at 2:30. Walter Murphy, as we've shown you, is standing outside the courthouse waiting for family members and others to leave that courtroom. We will have much more on the next steps of this trial of Michael Jackson-Bolanos beginning at 4 o'clock on CBS News Detroit. Again, if there is a press conference from the prosecution, the defense, or family, we will, of course, stream it live for you here. Rick, thanks for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate it.